Angela, good to see you as always, and thank you for making a bit of time in your diary to come and have a chat about what you're doing. I've long been interested in education, and I know you've got a really well, you're very passionate about education, and you've got an education business which is very interesting. So thank you for coming and having a chat with us. Just to kick the conversation off, tell us about the moment when you thought my business could have global impact. I mean, just talk us through that moment.
I guess it came as a little bit of a surprise, to be honest, that I realized it could be a global business because I got some global customers without actually trying. They just turned up. And that was the moment when I realized that the product that I had available was going to be of value outside of the UK. So there's a big international school network out there all across the world that are following a British or an international baccalaureate curriculum, very, very often in English. And then, of course, there's other English-speaking countries. At the moment, it is almost entirely international schools that are my global customers. But then another group that I'm working with quite closely is the Republic of Ireland schools, and
Right.
that's not interna it's not international schools now. You know the way we're thinking about the British international ones
Yeah.
and expat communities and so on. Those are like the sort of equivalent state schools in the Republic of Ireland. So to answer your question, initially just a bit of a surprise out of the blue, but quickly realized that suddenly the market was much, much bigger than I had anticipated.
And how did you feel about that? I mean, excited, presumably.
Excited and somewhat relieved because, as you know, having had experience with education in the past, it's quite a tough market.
Yeah.
So if you can have a bigger market, then so much the better.
Much the better. Yeah. And so you realized that you could have an impact globally.
Mhm.
How did you then go about making that happen? I mean, give us an idea about the kind of the plan, the delivery the approach. I mean, give us a sense of you think, okay, well, how do I do this then? I mean, tell us about that.
So that again, in education, you will probably have an appreciation that they're also quite a tough market to market to sort
Yeah.
of in
Yeah.
front of, because well, teachers are really busy. They're in the classroom. You can't pick up a phone and get a hold of them. More senior people that would be a bit more available have a lot of gatekeepers.
Mm.
And then often they'd be looking at some of the bigger, more strategic decisions as opposed to a curriculum and a training offer that would be more impactful for some of their staff lower
Mm.
down
Mm.
school. So the first challenge is just trying to get in front of people. So the main way I have done that is through various networks, like online,
Right.
just trying to build up a bit of a presence. Do sort of round table talks and so on with international school leads on topics that are sort of relevant to them and that I've got some sort of expertise about, and then just building it from there.
Mm.
Lots of the international schools are parts of big groups. So again, if you can be working with one or two within a group
Okay.
and then they're having a good experience, there's opportunities to ask for referrals to others within that group, but it takes time. So,
Mm.
you're probably thinking about working with those individuals for 1 to 2 years. They have to get through an academic year
Yeah.
um, to see the impact that your product has on them. And at that point, you're in a position to ask them to give you a bit of help spreading the word.
Yeah. So you work through the networks really. And
Yeah.
in terms of, I mean, tell us about how you see the CEO's role. I mean, in conventional wisdom is the CEO works out what are the things that he or she only they can do or only they can do really, really
Yeah.
well. And then you kind of delegate
Yep.
the other stuff to other people. I mean, when you've only got a small team like you, I mean,
Yeah.
that just doesn't work that way, does it? So tell us about how you see the role of the CEO in that context.
I think, when I'm thinking about that question, it's very much the theory and the practice, as
Mm.
you just said, don't quite match up. So in one of my previous roles, I worked very closely with students that were taking a gap year, They were placed in big companies often, more often than not, they were in big either research establishments or global organizations. Very, very bright young people that were going into science, technology for their future. So they had a deferred place at a top university. And, it was often described that these young people were going to be our future captains of industry. And so when you think about that captain of industry role, and in terms like a CEO, for example, you think about, they're at the helm of a big cruise liner with lots of
Yeah.
departments they're taking charge of all these teams. For a CEO like me and many others in very small businesses, it's more like you're in a little 1 or 2 man sailing dinghy,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
you're just trying to catch that wind to take you a little bit forward. And sometimes you're not going anywhere at all because there's no wind to catch.
Yeah.
And so you're multitasking all the time. If you've got a team, it's generally going to be a small team. And so it's, and then you can try and put some of that theory into practice with, delegating, because there's always going to be things that others are better at than you
Yeah.
are.
Yeah.
So, and I know a lot of CEOs find delegation difficult. I don't find that particularly difficult, and I'm not a micromanager. But what I do find difficult is my expectations, because I feel as if anybody in the team should be as passionate, enthusiastic as I am.
Yeah. And they're not always, are they?
But it's a job. It's a job, and they're being paid, and they might not have that same level of kind of excitement. So I suppose in a very small organization, the role of the CEO is to identify the people that can be part of your team that do have some enthusiasm and passion, and some skill that you don't have to enhance what you're doing, and just then trying to steer the whole thing forward and catch a bit of wind in your sails.
Yeah. I mean, and you've touched on the kind of the importance of the team. I mean, one of the things that always strikes me about this is that if you've got a small team, but you're trying to work in multiple jurisdictions, multiple parts of the world, I mean, you've got to build a team that's pretty flexible, that's pretty responsive, that is adaptable. I mean, often there are, things happen at different times in the day, don't they? If you're trying to work in Australia and here or whatever. I mean, tell me about your sort of take on building a high performing team that is very flexible. I mean, tell us about how you see that process, because you've got to get that right, because you can have all the vision in the world, but if you haven't got a team to help you deliver it, it won't happen.
Yeah, yeah. So, I mean, I've been lucky that some members of my team are very flexible,
Right.
in terms of when they work, they'll be very willing to help out. Um, in terms of, speaking to anyone in different time zones, I would take that responsibility anyway. I wouldn't expect them to do that. But the more general flexibility is it's it's sometimes quite nuanced, because if we're thinking about different countries, particularly looking at education, although they would be looking at a British curriculum, the actual culture they're working within can be very different. So in my team, the job that everybody wants to do the most is content creation. But if you're doing content creation for even though it's a British curriculum, but it's a different culture they're working within, they've got to be thinking about what's appropriate and what's not, make those subtle changes, have a slightly different product, and just have an appreciation not to be doing everything in complete British speak. I
Yeah.
mean, that even happens when, we've got English-based companies working with other parts of the UK. They just have an assumption that everything's following the English standards when it isn't necessarily. So it's sort of extrapolating that out a bit further and thinking about the culture that you're
Yeah.
working within.
Yeah, I mean, and when people talk about culture, I often think about customer expectations. I mean,
Mm,
what people expect in, I don't know, Singapore
yeah, yeah,
is very different to what they might expect in California. So, I
yeah.
mean, and how do you keep track of all of that? Because you're in lots of different places. I mean, how do you keep track of those
And
changing expectations?
I'm very guided by the customers. So I'll ask them, so
Right.
they're all using a pretty similar product, um, but I will ask them if there's adaptations and changes that they need for their particular culture. So a good example of that is alongside all the teaching material. One of the things that's very important for schools to do is consult with students. And so we've got an online questionnaire that can find out about their perceptions, their views, their behaviours, what they think of their curriculum.
Mm.
Um, and some of the questions that we could quite easily ask in the UK wouldn't be appropriate in some other parts of the world. And there's some surprises, even places in Europe, they might be far more conservative in terms of the sorts of topics that they would talk about with students, young people
Mm.
in the establishment. So it's important to talk to the customers, present them with the offer that they've got, but then keep checking in. Is this fit for purpose in your particular setting? Other adaptations that we need to make.
Mm.
And that's one of the beauties of being a small company. It's not difficult
Yeah.
to make the adaptations. And also one of the big advantages of having a flexible team. So one of the people in my team pretty much has full responsibility for all that, the survey side of things that we do. So she will um, very quickly make some adaptations, provide a slightly different version of the product for those schools.
Mm. And
Um,
one of the things I like about that, we've talked about this in the past. One of the things I really like about that is that what you're saying to customers is, how do I adapt this to meet your needs better? And I think that's a really important way to engage with customers. You're not saying, we've got a great product, do you want to buy it? You're saying,
yeah,
okay, we've got a great product, but we can tailor it
yeah,
specifically to help you with the issues that you're struggling with. And I think that's a really good sort of dialogue to have with
yeah,
customers. A lot of companies forget, they lose track of that as they get big, or they go in lots, they lose track
yeah,
of that. But I
yeah.
think that's actually really important.
I
And
know.
let me just ask, so, working in America, very different to working in Singapore. We've already
Mhm.
talked about that. I mean, but there's one is about customer expectation. Another issue is about risk, isn't it? And the potential for things to go horribly wrong. And the more places you're in, the more
Yeah.
opportunity is for things to go horribly wrong. I mean, what's your take on the kind of risk and uncertainty involved in those processes?
It's it's probably in my specific case, it's quite low risk.
Right.
Um, so you know, what could the risk be? Not being paid potentially. This doesn't really happen. It's not an expensive product, so that hasn't occurred. The content, as we just discussed, that if there was something that a school didn't like, they don't need to use it. It's not, so the content of lessons and so on isn't portal based. So I would never be in a position like some of the more high tech solutions where here's my offer, you press a button, it's on a
Mm.
screen, and it's kind of, you can't change it. It's, my offer is editable, so it means that teachers, there's an expectation that they're going to have a little look at what they're going to deliver in advance, and they could modify it if need be. So in terms of, you know, risk to, or they get into trouble with parents or someone else because there's content that's not appropriate, that wouldn't really be a high risk for me at all. The whole sort of financial side of it, it's not a hugely expensive investment at all for schools. So, and again, for nobody hasn't paid up to this point, but it's not as if I'd be investing a huge amount of money in a particular country or organization within it, and then have a risk of not being paid. So I think I'm in quite a fortunate position
Mm.
from that perspective, that it really isn't a particularly high risk business.
Mm. Yeah, and I'm sure that's a benefit when you're trying to have a global impact. I mean, one of the things you talked about at the beginning was how you were surprised that there was a bigger market for your
Mm.
product. It wasn't just the UK. I mean, So you responded. Okay, there's schools here that are interested. They're not in the UK, but I can respond to that.
Yeah,
Over time, have you shifted to a more proactive approach? I mean, you're responding to demand from outside the UK. That's
yeah.
one thing. If you were to now say, okay, well, I want to really build up my presence in America, for
Mhm.
example. I mean, how would you approach that? Would you develop a sort of a market entry strategy specifically for that jurisdiction, or would you still is it still just about responding to what comes your way?
Well, it, there is something that we're currently doing that is a strategy to build presence in a market that we're not currently in, but
Right.
it's got a lot of potential. So the if we're sticking with the international schools market, the most are in the UAE. So, as you'll know, culturally, that's a very different place from Europe or America or Australia or Canada, any of the English-speaking countries. Um, so, what we've actually done is developed a product that's specifically for schools in that region. So,
Right.
although they're following a British curriculum, sort of learned enough about the market to know that their sort of Department of Education still has oversight of what British international schools are doing, which means that there's a whole bunch of content. Because if we're thinking about the contents around the sort of personal development that includes taking risks and so on, which, in UK schools, it would be looking at drugs, education, alcohol. If we were looking at sort of values, rights, and responsibilities, it would be including things like LGBTQ communities. None of that can be included in an offer for UAE schools. So that is a proactive approach. So we're putting together a new product for them. There's a very sort of well-known and well-attended sort of conference exhibition, I think
Right.
around November. So the plan would be to get everything set up, be present there, even if not exhibiting, be in that space, setting up some meetings with schools. Some of the schools I'm already working with, they have other schools that are in that particular area. So in terms of developing some presence in a new market that's in a different part of the world, that's what I'm sort of going ahead with this
Sure,
year.
sure. And I mean, lots of people I've spoken to have talked about the importance of finding the right partners. I mean, which is what you're talking about. I mean,
Yeah,
to an extent, you've got to work with the Department for Education out there because they've got
yeah,
to be a
yeah.
good partner. But I mean, just give us your take on how you build relationships with those kind of partners, how you negotiate a deal with them. I mean, just give us a flavour of how you do that because. The way they do business in the UAE is very different to the way they do business in the UK. I
Yeah,
mean, yeah,
yeah.
it works in a very different way interpersonally, doesn't it? I mean, what's your sort of take on that negotiation
So,
process?
I mean, I haven't actually been doing anything at this sort of department level in those countries at the moment. But the way you can sort of work with partners to certainly get advice and think and look at whether your strategy is correct or not is through like organisations like BISA, British Educational
Okay.
Suppliers Association. So they will work with the Department of Trade and Business here. So you can start to be speaking with the sort of the government, sort of foreign office people that are working in those areas. You can get lots of advice and ideas about what to do, what not to do. They can then put you in touch with partners on the ground in those countries. Um, I mean, they tend to be more interested in bigger export opportunities than
Yeah.
something like I would be doing. But they certainly are there to support. I mean, BISA certainly is. The government sort of side of things, sometimes they want you to be turning over a minimum sort of figure before they're really going
Yeah.
to give much
Yeah.
support. So there certainly are partnerships that you can forge to help you enter those markets. So I mean, for an education person, BISA's definitely the place to
Yeah.
be
And
seen.
and as the CEO negotiating with people, I mean, that can be tough. What's your take on that?
So the people that I would be negotiating with is would be in the actual schools. I've not. I haven't done anything that's, getting a contract for all the schools in a particular area, for example. But, I think again, your sort of entry point to some of those individuals to even get a meeting is quite a tough one
Yeah,
because just because of the very nature of the product that I've got, where it would sit in terms of all the big strategic responsibilities and priorities, um, would probably make it even more difficult to get that sort of initial face to face.
yeah,
So I think that's probably going to be just a sort of step by step building relationships a bit further, lower down the chain,
yeah,
and then eventually getting noticed by some of these more executive level people,
yeah,
and just showing the impact that you're making, and certainly the good value for money. So I mean that's a proposition that I can very clearly demonstrate that they get a lot for their investment.
yeah, yeah. But so long term, what you're saying is you've got to think long term about some of these
I
things.
think
They're
so,
not going to happen
yeah.
overnight.
I don't know. So, I mean, it might be different in other industries. And I mean, and I suppose, I mean, some people might be looking for some sort of instant solution that can change things overnight, that marketing people are absolutely brilliant at sort of projecting and
Mm,
encouraging us to all have a look at and always looks beautiful and shiny. But in the world of education, the results that are, it's quite long term. It's
mm.
um,
Sales cycles are long, aren't
yeah, yeah. So and also in this sort of business, you need to have a lot of integrity. So you don't want a quick sale and nobody ever comes back. You want to build a relationship and keep them with you for the long haul, really.
they? Which requires investment on your point of view, doesn't it? In terms of
Yeah,
not necessarily money, but time and energy to build
yeah,
those
yeah,
relationships.
yeah.
Yeah, but they become very valuable. They become part of what makes you successful, doesn't it? Because if
Yeah.
you can create a relationship with customers and they where they really like working with you, that's the best ultimately the best way forward, isn't it?
And also to think, and again, if depending in the industry that you're looking at, and who your relationships are with, you need to be very mindful that some of those individuals might move on.
Yeah.
So you don't want one person to be your only route in somewhere. Because if they move on, it might, there's nobody else to carry on with if it's just been a very much a one-to-one relationship. So you do need to get some others involved to sort of future-proof that relationship.
Yeah, yeah. It's about working with the institution, not just the
Yeah, yeah,
individuals, isn't it? Yeah.
exactly.
Yeah, no, and again, really important skill to develop that, isn't it? And I mean, just a couple of things. I mean, other stakeholders. I mean, education is one of those areas where lots of people want to get involved, isn't it? I mean, so one is talking to schools and his kids and teachers, but what about the stakeholders more broadly? I mean, what's your sort of take on that? I mean, parents, for example, are going to have an influence on a lot of those things.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I think that w- p- within so the teachers obviously are the very much the kind of key stakeholder for me. But ultimately, it's the students it's for. So they're really the most important, but not decision makers necessarily. So in terms of stakeholders, it's always useful to think about um, that the definition between power and interest. So you can have no end of stakeholders that are really interested in what you're doing. And it can be sort of other people in the sector, charities, all sorts of
Mm,
consultants, all really keen to be sort of getting involved with what you're doing. But as a CEO, you need to make some decisions about where you prioritize your time and
yeah,
energy.
yeah,
So if people have got lots and lots of interest in what you're doing, it's great. But if they don't have any power to make decisions or kind of move what you're doing forward, then you need to be a little bit careful how much time you spend
mm,
with those particular
yeah.
stakeholders.
Because they can suck all the energy out of you, can't they?
And they can suck your energy and you don't actually get any, that it's not reciprocal.
Yeah,
They take a lot and don't really give anything in return. So that's something to be really careful of. The people you want. to be having the conversations, the relationships with are those in power, but they might not have any interest. So that's the other sort
Yeah.
of, so ideally, if you've got people that get interest and power, then that's where you can really get some great stakeholder relationships going that can help your business move forward.
Yeah, no, absolutely, and very succinctly put, actually, that you know, those two vectors, finding the point at which they meet, is pretty important, really. So
Yeah.
thank you for that. And a couple of final questions. I mean, I know you've been on a bit of a journey with this company. I mean, you've had a few ups and downs along the way. I
Yeah.
mean, when you look back, what have you learned? I mean, for example, have there been any big disasters when you've thought, "Oh my God, I'm not going to do that again"? I mean, tell us about the sorts of things that you've learned along the way.
I suppose the main right there's a few things I've learned. The main one is everything takes much longer than you think it
Yeah,
will.
yeah,
So you can come up with all these great ideas, and you know that you've sort of spoken to your market, you know they want it. You want to involve that you want to take that kind of bottom-up approach to develop something that's going to meet the need that they've identified. Um, but then working with people in education to market test and get feedback and so on is painful, because they're so busy, you know.
yeah.
So eventually you can, you have to give lots of time for the feedback to come back to you. And then the development and testing of products always takes longer than you anticipate. The academic year goes really, really quickly. Like a year goes fast anyway, especially when we're getting a little older,
Yeah,
Paul.
it does. It goes a bit too fast, if you ask
It
me.
goes too
Yeah.
fast, but the academic year, it's like a bit on turbo drive, so it's even faster. So that's something, just time, everything takes longer. The other thing to probably just do is have a bit of a tough skin. Don't take things personally.
Mm,
So I used to get very upset when we had people that were working, I had customers, they really liked the product, and then suddenly they didn't resubscribe. So we've been really lucky because the resubscription rate's high, probably because it's good value. Um, and it's a good product, of course, but you can't get too upset if you lose some along the way, because it might be an individual moves on, it might be that they just want to try something different.
mm,
So not taking things personally is very important. And then it's just, I guess, managing your expectations. So in terms of your team, we talked earlier about
mm,
team. So it's just have a bit of a reality check that they're not going to be so excited and passionate about it necessarily as you are. And
mm,
that's fine, because it's not their business. So just kind of keeping it a little bit real. And I suppose that's the sort of main things I've learned. And it's really hard. It's not, you've said this often. If it was easy, everybody would do it.
it's not.
And it's not. It's very hard. You need tenacity. You need to kind of keep your enthusiasm and passion for what you're doing, and not give up.
Yeah, I mean, lots of people describe it as a bit of a roller coaster. I mean, let me just ask you about that specific issue. I mean, what is it that gets you out of bed every day to ride that roller coaster? Because there's ups and there's
Yeah.
downs, and I
Yeah.
mean, all the time. And I mean, what is it that keeps you motivated?
Um, I suppose when I get very good feedback from
Right.
schools, that's very motivating. I know I'm doing the right thing. It's on the right track. But do you know, if we're thinking about it in a more sort of, if we're looking at it globally, if we absolutely need to be educating young people for a,
Mm.
a global workforce, a global sort of, everything they're doing is global these days. We cannot be
Yeah.
looking at in isolation wherever we are. So, and if we think about the sorts of skills that the World Economic Forum, others are saying that young people need moving forward to be able to prosper and thrive in this very global AI sort of context that we're looking at, is everything that I'm actually producing for teachers to support them on that journey. So it's, the so-called soft skills, which aren't really very soft, how to manage yourself and your emotions and think about, staying motivated and communication skills, negotiation, creative thinking, all
Actually,
those
really important stuff.
things. Absolutely. So we've got to be moving away from that knowledge-based, exam-driven, that's all we need to get by, because it's not. So that enthusiasm and drive and commitment to helping the next generation have the skills that will enable them to navigate a really complex world that keeps changing faster than
Yeah,
ever
yeah, yeah. I
is
mean, that's a
another
very.
thing
I
that
mean, it's
gets me out of bed.
changes. I mean, it seems to get faster every day, doesn't it?
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, no, I totally get that. One last question. One last question. So, if you were going to give one piece of advice, a golden nugget
Okay.
of advice to somebody that was thinking about, embarking on the journey that you've been on, I mean, what would that one golden nugget be?
Mm, I suppose be very, very clear in your own mind why you're doing it.
Right.
So is it because you want to make a change? Is it because you can see there's a potential to earn a load of money and you want to go and retire? And people have got different motivations. So my advice would be absolutely crystal clear why you're doing what you're doing. Because for me personally, I could certainly earn a lot more money in a job. Do you know that's
Yeah.
without a shadow of a doubt. I could give it all up, get a job, and I'd be much better off financially.
And less stress, probably.
Less stress, more time. But I suppose if we're looking at the kind of Maslow's hierarchy, I wouldn't be getting to those kind of top areas of the pyramid.
It's not as much. It's not as interesting
Yeah,
being working for somebody else,
yeah,
and
it's,
it's it might be more rewarding in some cases, but it's not as
yeah,
interesting, and it's
yeah,
not as
financially
exciting. I don't think.
rewarding. Yeah, yeah.
Because building a global business ultimately is quite an exciting
Okay.
experience, I think.
Yeah, it is. Mm.
Angela, thank you for
Thank you.
sharing that story. Absolutely fascinating.
Yeah,
Um,
absolute pleasure, Paul. Enjoyed it very much.
Fantastic. Hopefully, we will speak again soon.
Okay, thanks.
Cheers. Bye bye.
Bye.